Thank you to everyone here for joining this live event and to those viewing this recording. I'm so grateful to see so many new and familiar faces here. As well, I'd like to give a loving shout out to my amazing parents, Eddie and Lori. That never gets old for me to say. They're always there for me and always here for these events. And thank you to all the Holocaust survivors and their family members for sharing their testimonies with us, especially today's guest, Irene Stern Frielich. Welcome to 2G Tuesdays, a program where children of Holocaust survivors share their families' testimonies with us. My name is Michael Mantell. I'm a psychotherapist, educator, and a 3G, the grandchild of Holocaust survivors. These programs began in the fall of 2020, starting with the Sundays with Survivors program, the first one featuring Irving Roth of blessed memory. Since then, we've had dozens of Holocaust survivors and their family members. We've opened up the program to authors, actors, playwrights, elected officials, advocates, educators, and more. In addition to Holocaust education programming, we've expanded to include programming that cultivates Jewish pride and allyship and combat anti-Semitism and Jew hatred. We've raised thousands of dollars for museums, foundations, organizations, and incredible causes committed to Holocaust education, combating Jew hatred, and cultivating Jewish pride and allyship, and being a voice for Israel. And we've had people from all over the world joining us. In a few minutes, we will hear from Irene. Irene is from Sharon, Massachusetts. Her memoir, Shattered Stars, Healing Hearts, Unraveling My Father's Holocaust Survival Story, takes us on her transformational journey as she unravels her father's story and challenges her own beliefs about the world. Irene's memoir came out in October 2023, and it has already won 3 awards, most recently silver from Reader's Favorite in the nonfiction cultural genre. For her day job, Irene is the owner of an instructional design consulting firm based in Massachusetts. She and her husband, Seth, treasure moments with their growing kids, Jonah, Josh, and Josh's partner, Addie. Irene enjoys playing flute, kayaking, biking, and snowshoeing. And she's an avid cook and home entertainer. Irene is deeply grateful to the 18 courageous individuals who helped her family survive the Holocaust, some of whom she will be speaking about with us today. And we are grateful to them and to Irene for being with us today to share the testimony of her father, Walter Stern, of blessed memory, and his family. Following Irene's presentation, we will open up the program for Q&A. At that time, please feel free to raise your virtual hand using your hand raise emoji. Type your questions or comments into the chat box for me to share for you, or unmute yourself to speak. If you are raising your real hand and I do not see, please feel free to unmute yourself and share. And just one announcement before we begin. In 2 weeks, on Wednesday, September 25th, at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, please join us for a very special program featuring author Hannah Stiefel, who wrote a children's picture book about the Holocaust called The Tower of Life, based on the life and work of Yafa Iliach, who was a historian, author, scholar of Judaic studies and the Holocaust, and the creator of the Tower of Faces, which is made up of 1,500 photos for permanent display at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. The program will be co-sponsored by 3GNY, which is an educational nonprofit organization that seeks to preserve the legacies and lessons of the Holocaust through educational programming, and of which I'm a very proud board member. I want to thank you all again for being here today, and thank and welcome Irene. And with that, I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Michael. Hi, everybody. It's so nice to see so many smiling faces, or maybe apprehensive faces. I'm not sure what all the looks are, but that's okay. It's a little bit of a tough day, but and a tough year, but we'll get through it. I am going to share my screen just to make sure that all is working. So I am here today to share with you my father's story, and I am so honored to be speaking to a group of 2Gs like myself. You get it. You get where I'm coming from, so I don't have to explain myself, I often feel, as much. But my presentation today will be pretty much what I say to other groups of people, Jews and non-Jews and students, all kinds of audiences. But before I start sharing with you my father's story, I want to say that I've been doing these talks for about 6 years now, sharing my father's story all over. And unfortunately, almost every time I start the story, I need to actually start by saying something like, with the events that happened this past month, this story is more important than ever before because it seems like there's always been an anti-Semitic event in the past month. But now, in the past year, things, as we all know, are different. Anti-Semitism has grown to a volume we've not seen since the Holocaust. I know you all know that. Not everybody is aware of that, so I'm always sure to say that. And hate crimes in general are growing. So it's incumbent on all of us to do something about that. And that's really the core of my talk. I'm not here to bring the darkness of my father's story to you. I'm here to bring the light of his story to you, believe it or not. And I hope this light motivates people to carry forward their own light and to be an upstander ourselves in this troubled world. So I'd like to tell you about my father, Walter Stern. He was a Holocaust survivor. And as is the case for many children of Holocaust survivors, I lived most of my life holding secrets I didn't exactly know about. There was just an undercurrent in my household of not talking about it. I know many of you have had the same experience and many of you have had the opposite experience, but that was my experience. All I knew was that my dad escaped Germany with his family on Kristallnacht at the age of 12, and he survived in hiding on the Lansink farm somewhere in Holland, which is what they call the Netherlands. Everybody there just calls it Holland, so that's what I'm going to call it as well. I also know that he painted this brooch with the words Tikvat Yisrael in Hebrew, hope for Israel. And he painted it while he was in hiding on the Lansink farm. He gave me this brooch when I was around 10 years old. And I knew it was special, but I didn't know the story around it. Now, shortly before my father's death in 1994, he made a testimony video. It's not a testimony video that went anywhere, so it is not on file at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. It is not a USC Shoah Foundation project. It's not at Yale. He just made this privately and sent it to my brother and me. He made it shortly before his death, and we didn't receive it until after he died. So I watched it once and I put it away. I could not quite follow his chronology. I didn't understand the names of the Dutch places that he mentioned. And I never had the opportunity, because we got it after he died, to ask him the questions that I carried with me. And I'm sure throughout my whole life, when he was alive, he didn't want to tell me the stories because he didn't want to cause me pain. And I certainly didn't want to ask him the questions because I didn't want to cause him pain. That probably sounds familiar to a lot of you. Well, I took out the video again in 2017, pretty recently. And this time, I could Google the places he talked about and locate them on a map. And I also gained a clearer understanding of the photos, documents, and letters that I had kept from my father's things. And that got me eager, although my husband's word for this is obsessed, which I kind of go along with, but I became obsessed to find out more. I needed to know more. I needed to immerse myself in my father's childhood. So in 2018, with my husband, Seth, and our oldest son, Josh, we took the first of 3 trips to physically retrace my father's footsteps from his home in Germany, across the border to temporary safety in Holland, and even to his hiding place. So I invite you on the journey with my father and me as he escapes Nazi Germany and survives in Holland. And as my family and I travel in his footsteps and see some of the locations where at least 18 individuals, most of whom I know by name, helped my family to survive. These people demonstrated courage, compassion, and kindness. They risked their livelihoods and their lives to do what they considered to be the right thing. They acted, they did something. They weren't simply bystanders. Again, my purpose here today is not to make you sad, but it is to move you to act, to find ways that you, each and every one of us, can demonstrate our own courage, compassion, and kindness. Let me introduce you to my family. Here's my father on the bottom at about the age of 11. And his parents were Moritz and Hilda. Hilda was my grandmother. I called her Oma, the German word for grandmother. And Oma's parents were Sally, who died when Oma was 9 months old, leaving her mother, Selma, a single mom with a baby. And a few years later, Edward Hertzfeld comes into the picture and marries Selma, and they have a son named Kurt. So Kurt is my great uncle, and these are the people you'll be hearing about today. And if you like maps, these are the places we'll visit. The important thing is that Bocholt, the town where my father was born, is the only town in the story that is in Germany. The rest of the towns are across this green line, which is the border between Germany and Holland, the Netherlands. The rest of the towns are in the Netherlands. And lucky for my family, they lived on the border, which was one of the contributing factors to their ability to survive. In 1902, my great-grandmother Selma is already living in Bocholt with her daughter Hilda, my Oma. And Selma's soon-to-be second husband, Edward Hertzfeld, arrives in 1910 and marries Selma soon after. And they have their son Kurt in 1913. Edward sets up Hertzfeld, which is a clothing and textile store. This is a photo we have of their family store from the 1920s. And the family lives in the top 2 floors of the building. By 1926, my grandfather Moritz Stern, he comes to Bocholt to run the Hertzfeld store. And Moritz marries my Oma, and they have my father 9 months later. And you can see my father here in the carriage, his little head sticking up on his first walk down the Nordstrasse, which is the name of their street. They live 1 block away from the town hall. So they live right in the downtown, right in the center of town. And this is what the town hall looked like around 1930. I actually found this photo on the Bocholt Archives Facebook page, where they have a lot of old photos. It's a really interesting Facebook page. Now, up to this point, my family lives a relatively good life. They're German citizens, they own a successful business, and they expect a decent, if not a good and happy future. Same was true for Jews all over Germany at that time. But as you all know, in 1933, Hitler comes into power, and he declares a national boycott of Jewish businesses. On April 1st, 1933, the windows of my family's store were shattered for the first of many times. Now, this photo is not my family's store. It's one that I found on the internet. So customers begin to fear coming into the Hertzfeld store. And so what does my grandfather, Moritz, do? He gets on his bicycle and bikes out to his customers, some of whom live across the border in Holland. He takes their orders, comes back to fill those orders, and bikes back out with the goods. That's how he's able to keep his business going. Now, this is what the town hall looks like, and the building across the street from it looks like in the 1930s. You can see on the top of the town hall is the Nazi slogan, Ein Reich, ein Volk, ein Führer. one land, one people, one leader. Basically the definition of a fascist government. And my father, at the age of 8, 9, and 10, has to walk between these two buildings with the Nazi slogan and with the picture of Hitler on it to get to school. In 1935, the Nuremberg laws go into effect. And again, as you know, these are race-based laws, and among other things, they define who is a Jew. Many restrictions are placed on Jews, including the prohibition of intermarriage. They strip Jews of their German citizenship, and they restrict employment. They restrict employment. And after the Nuremberg laws go into effect, Jews are forbidden from flying the Nazi flag or colors. That was an interesting point that I had learned. I don't know why Jews would be flying them anyway, but they were restricted from flying them. And this actually is another photo. This one from the Bocholt Archives Facebook page is taken around the corner from where my family lived. And my father walks down these streets as a child, and he shares in his testimony video that kids would spit at him, they would throw rocks at him, and they would call him dirty Jew. But he's not permitted to retaliate in any way out of fear that his father would be sent to a concentration camp. This sweet boy, there's my father right here, is so traumatized that he actually needs sedatives to calm him. Now, my grandfather Moritz, he expects things to worsen. He is clear about what's going to happen, and he makes plans to protect his family. I didn't know these details until I listened to my father's testimony video. And I'd like my father to help tell a part of the story. Actually, it's my father's story that I'm helping to tell, but my father's going to be actually speaking for part of it. So let's listen to an audio clip from his testimony. And if you can't hear it, please put something in the chat right away to let me know.
My father was smuggling his own money into Holland on weekends on a bicycle. He removed the saddle and he had a rubber tube filled with money, and he slid it all the way down into the tube of the bicycle.
And this path is the approximate 7-mile bike route they took that Seth and I also rode on bicycles on one of our visits.
And we were riding to Holland to go and visit, on a nice Sunday afternoon. And he would go to Alton to see this particular rabbi, and he would have a special rod there in Holland with a hook on it and pull the money out again. And the rabbi would then the next day deposit that money for us in a Dutch bank. But we did not know about it. We were not supposed to know about it, just in case somebody would get caught. Nobody would know about it, could talk about it.
And I'm struck here by the creativity of my grandfather, right, coming up with this elaborate plan, and the fact that there were these secrets, right? I felt like there were secrets growing up. My father lived with secrets as well. So this is Seth and me. We also visited Alton, and this is us in front of the synagogue, which is still standing. It's next to the former rabbi's house that my father talked about. The synagogue now mostly acts as a museum. There was only one Jew left in the town when we visited. He was pretty elderly, and his story was just so breathtakingly sad. I don't even want to share it. It was just heartbreaking. So back in Bocholt, this is in Germany, in my family's hometown. It's November 1938, and my father's birthday is on November 10th. He's turning 12 years old. So this is the family unit and approximately what they look like at this time, give or take a year or two. Let's hear what happens on November 9th to 10th. You all know it's a violent night, a night that will become known as Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. It's also night the Stern family, and Sterne in German means stars, that the stars were shattered. The Stern family was shattered. Let's hear from my father.
There were numerous men in brown uniforms on the street holding a steel I-beam and poking not only the windows but also poking into the doors, the two house doors. This door had a separate door from the private entrance, and they just demolished it so you could walk right into the house all the way through. It was so bad that the glass particles were in the clothing that were hanging in the store way in the rear. Nothing of it was usable anymore. It was loaded with glass. That, of course, was a great shock to us. And then we heard also gunshots in the street. And now we knew they meant business. They really wanted to get rid of us. And in order to avoid any confrontation with these drunken people, whatever they were, animals, they sounded like animals. The sound was so shrill and loud, and whatever they said there, it was the hatred. You could hear the hatred and feel the hatred. And it was a vibration in the air, and my father directed us all to escape to the roof. He had always planned an escape route in many different ways.
Once on the rooftop, my family waits for things to quiet down. And that night, more than 7,500 Jewish-owned businesses are destroyed throughout Germany. That night, the crowd in Bocholt moves on to destroy the synagogue, which is just a 5-minute walk from my family's home. Across Germany, more than 267 synagogues are destroyed. Many of them are burnt to the ground. On the left is a photo of the interior of the Bocholt synagogue, probably taken in 1927 by my uncle Kurt, who was a photographer. And on the right is a photo of the synagogue in Bocholt after the destruction. Interestingly, the Bocholt synagogue was not burnt down because next door was a supplier of wood products. The owner, who was a Nazi, was concerned his business would be at risk, and he would not let the brown shirts next door set light to the kerosene that was already on the ground. So while it was destroyed a little bit later, it was not destroyed, it was not burnt down on Kristallnacht. Now, while the Bocholt synagogue is being destroyed, my family hides toward the rear of their building,
facing a neighbor in the rear who was a good man. His name was Imping. And Imping was a keeper of horses for other people, race horses, etc. Also, he made a living with burning coffee. They had these old-fashioned coffee burning machines. He had a large property, and my father was opening the window, standing on a ladder, on a small ladder, step ladder, and through the night was Imping, please help us. He got us down from our window by a ladder, yes. And he was hiding us in his hayloft, and he also was providing us with a limousine to take us to the border. Yeah. That is at the risk of his own life.
Okay, Shafir, if you can't hear, I'm not sure what to say other than maybe try turning up your volume, which is probably an obvious thing. And I apologize that you can't hear. So Mr. Imping, who, by the way, if you do read the book, I call him Mr. Roaster because I had to change a couple of names, and that was one of the names I changed. And roaster means coffee roaster in German. So I was very creative with my naming conventions. Anyway, Mr. Imping is the first of over 18 people who act with courage, compassion, and kindness to help ensure that my family would survive. And the limo driver is the second person who acted with courage. He's contacted by Mr. Imping to drive my family to the Dutch border. The limo driver drops them at a spot that my grandfather directs him to, according to his plan, just on the German side of the town in Holland called Mechelen. That's called Mechelen. That's why I couldn't understand anything my father said about the Dutch towns. This is what Mechelen looks like now. And this photo is taken by my son Josh from his drone, because who doesn't bring a drone when they go to Europe? I don't know, but I'm glad he had his drone. It's a beautiful picture of a idyllic farming community. I learned from my father's video something very interesting. I learned that my grandfather has a customer who owns a farm that is half in Holland and half in Germany. And Maritz's plan is to cross the border on the customer's farm from Germany into Holland. So the limo driver drops them near where that yellow box is on the German side of the border. And let's listen to what happens.
And there my father says, wait. And we were hiding in a ditch. It was a dry ditch, and they put our heads down, and he waited for the gendarme on the German side, who was guarding the border there, to go at 11:45 to take his bicycle, noontime, to go home for lunch. And at 12 o'clock, the new gendarme would arrive in order to guard this area.
Now, when we got to this area, we were surprised to see so many of these ditches along the border. I couldn't imagine what my father meant by ditches. And that's Josh, who jumped into one of the ditches to take some pictures. And if I had stepped a few feet away, I would not have been able to see him hiding in the ditch. On Thanksgiving morning, during my second trip in 2018, Josh and I decided to walk from Germany across the border in this spot that's highlighted in yellow. And we later confirmed that this was the exact farm and the exact spot where Maritz's customer lived and my family crossed. And I'm going to play for you what I videoed as I walked across the border, because it's just so, well, you'll hear it. We're in Germany right now. That might have been the farmer's house where my family escaped on the day after Kristallnacht. And we're taking a path near that farm. And in one moment, we're going to be crossing the border into the Netherlands, as my family did 80 years ago this month in this very cold weather, wearing only their pajamas and coats. And right now, I give Thanksgiving that we were able to be here. And still, every time I listen to that, I am just so moved by everything. And that all that noise you heard, that was the wind. That was not static. It was really cold, and we had our warm coats on. So I can't even imagine how it was for my family of 1938. So this is Josh just crossing over the other side of the border now into Holland, looking over at that farmhouse. And in 1938, my family continues up the road this way for about a half a mile to this location, to a house owned by a baker named Jan Duking. We learned that he had helped a lot of refugees during the war years. So let's listen to my father's recounting of the next part of their escape.
In Mechelen, there was a turnaround street. On the right-hand side, the Dutch police came. There were 3 of them, and arrested us. On the right-hand side, the Dutch marechaussee, which is like state troopers, state police, came, and they wanted to arrest us. And the Dutch police said to the state troopers, no, they're under our jurisdiction, we got to them first, we are arresting them, they're in our custody. The state trooper says, you can't do that. The state is more important than your little town. He says, you will have to take it up with the Congress, you have to take it up with the Queen. We have the law, and these people are in our custody, and over our dead body, you'll get to these people.
The local police placed my family under house arrest for their own safety in nearby Hendringen. So the G is pronounced gutturally, Hendringen. One of the reasons they're permitted to stay in Holland is that they have money in Holland. So remember the money that my grandfather had smuggled in? And Harry Slogger, a Dutch relative who had managed the bank account for the smuggled funds, he comes to Henringen to vouch for my family and tell the authorities that my family can come live with him. Let's listen to more about the situation for my family in Henringen.
And we were guarded by the local police. This was during a time of about 10 days, where every day my father would approach or go to the mayor in town. He had to report to him, so to prove that we were still there and did not escape. The mayor would try to legalize our stay in Holland. And of course, Congress turned us down. We would have to be sent back to Germany. And the Senate, which was the Dutch Senate, a similar organization as here, the court different, was saying no, send us back. The Justice Department said no, they cannot stay, we will have to be sent back to Germany. And ultimately, the mayor said, I'm appealing to the Queen. That is Queen Wilhelmina. And she gave us a stay. All right? Now, he said to her, I will send these people back over my dead body. I refuse to do it. My conscience does not allow to do that. If yours does, please say so. And she says, no, I can't send those people back.
So I don't know how much you know about Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands, but it turns out that because there was such a huge influx of German Jewish refugees that crossed the border in the months after Kristallnacht, she has to do something. And so she sets up a refugee camp outside of the northern town of Westerbork or Westerbork in Holland. Have you heard of Westerbork before? Many people have, and that will come back in our story in a little while. But I'll say that my family is fortunate in that they have means and they're able to live independently, so they don't need to go to this refugee camp. In fact, these are the homes where my family stay in Henringen for about 6 months as they await their furniture and things, which was a big mystery that I ultimately solved, how they got their furniture from Germany. Do you have questions about that at the end? I can tell you about that. And once they got their furniture, that's when my family moves from Henringen to another town in Holland where Harry Slogger lives. It's called Enschede. And if anybody here speaks Dutch and want to correct my pronunciation, please do. And that's the best I can do with that town. Now, on September 1st, 1939, Germany invades Poland and World War II has begun. A couple of months after that, my father becomes a bar mitzvah in this beautiful synagogue in Enschede. It still exists and it still is in use, and it's also a museum now. And I just love the building so much, as my father did, that I had to take this video and include it today. In May of 1940, just 8 months after World War II began, Germany invades Holland, as well as Belgium, Luxembourg, and part of France. And Queen Wilhelmina leaves for the UK, and Holland, in 5 days, Holland capitulates. They can't stand up to the Nazi army. And within days of that, my grandfather Moritz and Uncle Kurt are arrested, and they are eventually sent to labor camps in Vichy, France. We have this drawing of my grandfather that is smuggled out of the Camp Rivesaltes in Vichy. Now, in January 1942, the final solution to the Jewish question is codified in Wannsee. And although plans, as you know, had already been in place to exterminate all the Jews and the mass killings were already in place, this conference ensured that those in attendance were clear they were expected to obey. Now, remember Camp Westerbork, the refugee camp that Queen Wilhelmina had set up? Shortly after the Wannsee Conference, Camp Westerbork is taken over by the Nazis, and it becomes a transit camp from which 97,000 Jews out of 102,000 total in Holland are shipped to their deaths. Now, luckily, again, my family wasn't there, but my grandfather and great uncle were in labor camps in Vichy. And I was able to locate the following information about my grandfather Moritz on the Yad Vashem website. What I learned is that in Drancy, France, on August 31st, 1942, Moritz and over 1,000 people, including hundreds of French children, are herded onto a train. It is transport number 26, train 901-21, destination Auschwitz-Birkenau, extermination camp, Poland. We all know the story too well. But the rest of my family would not learn of Moritz's fate until well after the war. Now let's return to Holland. In April of 1942, a few months before Moritz's death, Jews in all of Holland are required to wear the yellow Jood star, and in Dutch it's spelled J-O-O-D. Interestingly, a formerly Jewish-owned textile factory that then became Nazi-run has to create the yellow stars for all of Holland, which they do in 3 days. And this is my father's actual Jood star, which I have, and I always bring these with me when I do presentations, and I let people hold them in its plastic covering. It's a very special, sacred experience if you haven't had a chance to do that. What's also really interesting is that this factory that manufactured all of these stars was a half mile from my father's home in Enschede, as it turns out. So the Nazis are rounding up Jews systematically now. And on October 3rd, 1942, expecting a roundup, my Oma accesses the well-connected underground and pays someone they refer to as a smuggler to take her, her son, and her mother into hiding. So imagine this. My father, who's 15 at the time, he rides one bicycle and the smuggler rides a second bicycle. My Oma hops on the luggage carrier that's on the back of the bicycle that my father's riding. And my 70-year-old great-grandmother sits on the luggage carrier on the back of the smuggler's bicycle. On the slide is what my father had written about that event. And I'd like to play for you now what he says in his testimony video.
We drove into the dark out of town. We circumvented the guards that were placed at the end of town, and we came through the dirt roads that are used by the farmers. We finally arrived after an hour and a half of bicycle riding. We arrived on a farm, and we were brought indoors, and there was one son and another son, and the boss himself greeting us, and they were staring at us like we were from outer space and not knowing what was going on really. And that night we were sleeping on the floor in the living room.
I just think about this family, you know, clearly they didn't have a plan, but they did what they thought was the right thing. It's just amazing to me. I don't know that I could do something like that. So my family arrives at the Lansink farm in this little town of St. Isidorus Huva. And before I started my research, I never dreamt I'd be able to visit any of my father's places, much less the farm where he was hidden. But we were able to. And here we are in June of 2018, and under that white circle, joined by my brother and sister-in-law, looking at the renovated farmhouse from Josh's drone. In 1942, this structure was half home and half cow barn, attached all in one building. And under the blue box is where my father, my Oma, and my great-grandmother hid in the attic. The family who now lives in the former Lansink home had been expecting us. They invited us inside and up the stairs toward the attic where my family had hidden. Here, we approach the area of the closet that my father suggested be built to hide the secret door to the attic. I was kind of having an out-of-body experience while this was happening. We entered the attic, and they still need a living quarter within the attic. So let's listen.
And then later on, the next day, he got a carpenter, and I helped the carpenter to build a hiding corner, a nook, underneath the roof. It was a slanted roof with shingles, and they just timbered it off where the hay and the straw was on the other side, so we could make a nice little living quarter out of it with a hot plate in it and a pail as a latrine covered with a potato sack. And we would go down a few steps to our little nook.
So you can see the nook pretty much is here, but the original nook was a couple of steps further down before the house renovation, but there wasn't a lot of headroom. One of the things my father does while in hiding is he listens to the BBC on one of the 6 radios, each of which is illegal. So the radios are hidden with the Jews because they're all illegal. Let's listen to my father's description of something he heard, and be aware that this is somewhat graphic.
The British would tell us in detail what was going on over the radio, and I just, it hit me like a shock, and I could see my father burning in the oven. I could see all this, just imagination, you're young. At the time I was 17 years of age, 16, 17 years of age. I did not tell my mother or my grandmother what I heard. I just left it alone. I just digested it for myself. And I had to digest it for a while.
I can't even imagine that. I can't imagine feeling like you couldn't talk about that with anybody. Well, we know he was right. His father had been killed in Auschwitz in September of 1942, and that was even before they had gone into hiding. And this is my brother and me standing right outside that nook. I'm so glad my brother could be there with me. So let me ask you this. You're isolated. You're unable to be with friends or go outdoors. There are no electronics except for a radio. How do you pass the time? My father does chores such as butter churning and crafts such as painting wooden brooches like the one I have. My son made these replica tokens that we used as our trip symbol, and we actually left one at each ancestral grave that we visited, and there were 16 direct ancestral graves that we visited. Farmer Jan Lansink, the boss as my father calls him, risks his life and the lives of his grown children, and yet they choose to hide my family, plus 3 other Jewish people, plus 17 others, conscientious objectors and the like. My father shared in his testimony video that there were 6 close call stories, and I like to share one of them that I share. And it's the only story that my father actually told me directly. One second, I just lost my place. Okay, one summer day, it's just too hot in the attic. And my father says, I heard boots, army boots, coming up the stairs. My mother and grandmother, he says, were sitting in a bedroom upstairs, knitting at an open window. And I did not have enough time to get them into the attic because they were sitting 2 bedrooms down. I quickly took the pail, the latrine, into the nook. I closed the closet door and I closed my door, locked it up. I just heard them now speak to my mother, he continues. And my mother was answering him, and they disappeared again. And then my mother and my grandmother quickly came running to the nook. They knocked on the door. I opened it. I let them in. I locked it up again. And they were pale and their face like a sheet. What did happen? Well, the tall policeman was standing in the bedroom doorway, looking at my father's mother and grandmother, and he was blocking the view of the short policeman who was standing behind him. And the women in the bedroom could see the hat of the short policeman going over the shoulder of the tall policeman, trying to see what was going on. But the tall policeman lied. He told the short one, "It's the farmer's wife. She's getting ready for bed. She's not dressed properly. Please don't look." The tall policeman, my father goes on to share, was a member of the Dutch underground who distributed food coupons to Jewish people who were hiding. And it turns out that he knew there were Jewish people on this farm. So he tried to go when there were checkups like this. Now, due to the strong resistance in this part of Holland, about 38% of the Jews in this area survive. And that's compared to less than 20% of the Jews who hide in Amsterdam. That's a big difference. That's twice as many. One of the members of the resistance in the Netherlands was the Protestant Reverend Lendert Overdown. He's the guy who found the safe addresses, the hiding places for Jews and also for people who just needed to go into hiding. Interestingly, my father mentioned him many times in his video. And so I researched Father Overdown, who's famous in this part of Holland. And we actually found our way into the great church in Enschede just to see this plaque that we knew was in there. The church is closed up now, but we found our way in there because I wanted to see the plaque and in that way offer my thanksgiving to Dominee Overdown. Now, before we get to Liberation Day, you might be wondering how I located the former Lansing farm. And it's a bit of a story that I'm not going to get into all the details of it, but it ends with us being reunited with this man who is Jan Lansing, the grandson of farmer Jan Lansing. And it is this man's father and grandfather who hid my family. So we were, I feel like, reunited with almost a family member. And I knew that my father had been in touch with him over the years, but the language barrier prevented us from continuing that relationship. And Jan had brought my father back to that farmhouse and attic on the only time my father visited Holland in 1991. And he brought us there too. So here's Jan looking at the Tikvat Yisrael token that I had brought him, the replica token that I had brought him. Now, let's resume with Liberation Day, back on the farm. On April 1st, 1945, Allied soldiers arrived to the Lansing farm.
We came downstairs and the Canadian soldier said to my mother, he says, "You know, the button came off my pants. Can you sew it?" And it was like a mitzvah. She was smiling and enjoying every moment of it, and she sewed the button out.
Amazing. That's obviously my favorite part of the whole thing. Well, the rest of Holland is liberated on May 4th to 5th, and my great-grandmother is very ill. And Selma dies on May 7th, and she's buried in a Jewish cemetery nearby the farm. This photo on the left was taken in the 1940s. And here are my brother and me paying our respects on our visit in 2018, leaving one of those Tikvat Yisrael tokens at her grave before reciting the mourner's Kaddish. Sadly, Selma doesn't get to see the end of World War II in Europe, which is declared on May 8th with Germany's surrender. My Oma and my father moved back to Enschede in 1945 with the help of Farmer Lansing. And in 1946, my Oma receives this letter from the Dutch Central Registration Office for Jews. In French, it explains that her husband, my grandfather, Maurice Stern, was deported. Now, I know you all know the answers to these questions, but I ask in every group, do you know how many people were killed in the Holocaust? And people give me two different numbers, right? So I say, that's right, 6 million, Jewish people were murdered in the Holocaust, including 1 million Jewish children. And I go on to say, did you know that Jewish people weren't the only targeted victims? Because the 12 million figure that people will have thrown out is also correct. And I feel like it's really important to mention all of the groups that were targeted and acknowledge them. And that includes up to 250,000 people with disabilities who were living in institutions. They were murdered. 250,000 to 500,000 Romani people were murdered. An unknown number of homosexual people were murdered. Also targeted and murdered were Freemasons, Jehovah's Witnesses, political prisoners, Serbs, and Slovenes. And that doesn't even include the 3 million Soviet prisoners of war and 1.8 million non-Jewish Polish civilians. And I always ask my audiences to think about this. If we aren't the ones to speak up for others, who will be left to speak up for us? At some point, my Oma learns of all the relatives and friends who were killed, plus her mother, whom I consider a victim of the Holocaust. And the people on this list are just her very closest relatives. You can see at the bottom is Harry Slager, the man who helped them survive, who helped them come to Enschede, and his young son, Max, who was only 7 years old. In 1947, my Oma and Dad pack up their crate labeled for Riverside Drive in New York City. Some of you may know where that is. And they take the ship, the Marine Falcon, to America. Apparently, they're all very seasick on the journey, as my Oma wrote on the back of that photo. And for some reason, that normal kind of discomfort makes me smile. Well, they build a life here in America. My Oma marries again. My father works hard. He marries Margie, my mom, and lives the American dream for my brother and me. So is anybody who I can see on the video interested in hearing what happened to Bocholt at the end of the war? I'm seeing some yeses. Okay, so let me share with you briefly. Back in Bocholt, my family never went back there. My father never went back there. Bocholt was pretty devastated toward the end of the war. It was bombed out, as you can see in some of these pictures. Actually, in March of 1945, the Allies bombed it out pretty thoroughly. And that included my family's home and business was right in this area. So even though it had been Aryanized in 1938 to 1939 by a neighbor, they were trying to reclaim it and weren't able to. So when I was there, I went into the former store that my family owned and where they lived, and we met the grandson of the man who Aryanized my family's home. And here he is with his sister. So here we have two siblings whose grandparents were neighbors of two siblings, my brother and me, and whose grandparents Aryanized our family's home. And he lives in this home. He lives upstairs still in the rebuilt building in the same space where my family lived. And I have to tell you that even though I didn't tell you really much about my experience, my transformational experience, but meeting this man in particular multiple times over my 3 trips was probably the most transformational experience for me that I had, that just changed how I thought about the world. So today, I wanted to focus on my family's survival story and the upstanders, those who found it within themselves the spark to act with courage, compassion, and kindness. And I feel it's really important to bring them fully into this virtual room with us, even those I haven't told you about today. Some of them have no one left to remember them. And so I'm going to bring them into this space by saying their names, and you can feel free to just say the names aloud with me. I want them to know that I'm remembering them. Mr. and Mrs. Imping, The Limousine Driver, Jan Duking. Hendrikus Nicolas Wiendels, Jan Anton Beaumont. Families Kussel and Speer, Queen Wilhelmina. Harry and Hilda Flogger, Sig Menko. Bernard Sanders, Reverend Lindert Overdown. Jan Lansing and his adult children, Gerhard Lansing and Mina Lansing, and the Dutch resistance. We as human beings, we each have that spark within us that they had. And so I appeal to everyone today as a testament to the 6 million Jewish people who perished, and to the 6 million more who perished, and to the numerous righteous Gentiles. Please, don't simply stand by and watch when someone is in need, no matter how far away they might be. Please stand up when someone is in need. Speak out against bullies and autocrats, against dictators and terrorists and hate mongers. And I encourage all of us, to talk with someone who we think is different than us. We can show genuine interest in one another, and we can help build empathy and send out positivity. I ask you to perform even the smallest acts of kindness to help make our world a better place. And I thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much, Irene. I'll start by saying thank you. Thank you for going on this journey, for sharing your father's life with us and taking us on your emotional, psychological, and physical journey. You really do a beautiful job weaving together your story with your father's story. And in effect, you share both these narratives living together at the same time that transcends time and space. And speaking personally, I mentioned this to you before, your book, which is right here, your story, I wanted to say touched me, but it actually it hit me hard. It was so powerful and captured so much of not just a Holocaust testimony, but a story of a daughter and a father, and having your own children and trying to reclaim your family's story, getting to know people you may have met. The Holocaust didn't happen, some even further in the past that you wouldn't have met, but just connecting with ancestors and family was beautiful. So thank you for that. You're an incredible storyteller. This presentation was absolutely incredible, and the book is the same. So first, was it always your intention? Before I ask the question, I just want to remind everyone that this is a time for all of us to share our thoughts, ask questions. I'm going to start the ball rolling, but I feel like you're all my family, so just like family does, interrupt me at any time. You can unmute yourself. You can write your questions in the chat box, and I have a few that people already came with in my own. So first, was it always your intention to write this book when you started your journey? And if not, when did that idea to write this book come about?
It most certainly was never my intention to write a book ever in my entire life. The moment it gelled in me was in the plane on my second trip coming home, talking to my son about these amazing things that happened on my second trip, not just these transformational things, but also all these coincidences that happened that just felt like my father was leading the way. And I felt like I owed it to my family to write the story. So it was in November of 2018 that I decided I had to write it. And it was laborious because I'm not a writer. I've never written a book before. I write short things for work, but I had never written something like this before. So it was really hard for me. Did that answer that question?
Yes, and you make it look really easy. I'll say that. You did an incredible job. In fact, I mentioned to you previously that I thought you must have been a writer because you wrote so well.
Thank you.
Yeah, we do have a number of questions from the audience. I'm going to share theirs as well, but just also to go with some chronology with these questions, can you talk a little bit about the process of this journey, writing the book, doing the research, and how you kind of figure out where you were going on your physical journey in Europe?
And that's a big question, so I'll try to keep the answer somewhat short, and I'll go in order. So first was deciding to go on this journey to visit my ancestral hometowns in Germany and to retrace my father's footsteps. And I decided I was going to do that towards the end of 2017 after I really listened to my father's video, and then I started finding branches of my family I had never heard of before and their hometowns, and finding that I could go to those places and see where, where Selma was born. I had no idea who her family was before that. None at all. So it was a combination of luck and or somebody leading me, I don't know, and genealogy research and the papers my father had saved that brought me down this path of being able to do this. And then I made the very difficult decision of flying into Germany, going to a place that my father swore he would never go back to, and kind of feeling like I was violating my father by doing that. And I didn't enjoy it on my first trip. I did not enjoy being in Germany at all. And that was, I saw a question about meeting the owners of the store. The first time, that picture that you saw was the first time. I have never been shaken so much in my life about anything I ever did. And it was just very difficult for me. But on my second trip, why I went back a second time because there was a triennial Kristallnacht commemoration ceremony in one of my ancestral hometowns. And I had just learned about it and I wanted to go to that. And that was where Moritz, my grandfather, was born, in a little town, a couple hours from Bocholt. So I went to that, and that experience was life-changing for me. And then I had arranged to meet, his name is Johann. I use a different name in the book, but Johann is the man who owns my family's store now. We met for an hour over coffee, and that was life-changing. I don't want to give away the chapter, but I will tell you. So spoiler alert. He had asked me to bring some photographs of the building because he wanted to see what it used to look like. So I brought the photographs, and I also brought other photographs. And as he was looking at them one by one, I would give him a little bit of the story of my father's story. And he was crying. He was crying. And you saw him. He's a big, Aryan-looking man. And the story moved him, and he talked about his feelings and his own experience of his grandfather, probably the other grandfather, not the Aryanizer, who was a prisoner of war during and after the war in Siberia. And I realized he was traumatized, just like I was. Like, he carried this inherited trauma. So that was another life-changing thing. And so that combination of things caused me to start writing the book. And then we went back the third time the following June, so all 3 trips within 1 year, to lay Stolpersteine memorial stones in front of my family's home, in where Johann lives, and he was at the ceremony. So that's I tried to abbreviate that.
You did a great job.
To that.
You answered it well. Just talking about these stumbling stones, I don't know if people know about it. Do you mind sharing a little bit about it? It's incredible. And there's actually a documentary movie that was just made about it. Can you share a little bit about the stumbling stones?
Yeah, so the stumbling stones, that's the literal definition of Stolpersteine. So it's actually an art project started by a man named Gunther Demnig, who is German, not Jewish, German, and started a while ago, where these little brass stones that are about 3 inches by 3 inches are placed in front of the last willful residence of each Jewish anybody who was displaced from their home all throughout Europe. And so you can request to have them put in, or the town will request to have them put in, and they're installed. And sometimes there's a moving ceremony that goes along with it. We kind of created our own, and like 70 townspeople showed up to it, and it was quite moving. I can actually send, when I send you an email, Michael, I can send you a link to the video that the town made of our ceremony if people are interested in seeing it.
That would be awesome. Yeah, the stumbling stones also, they're made by hand, meaning like they're not done by machine. They're intentionally done, each one individually by the artist or the person who's making them. It's a very incredible thing and intentional in that respect.
I didn't realize that.
Yeah, very beautiful. And they wanted to keep it that way. So it does take a little bit longer. And for your particular family, I know it's usually in the home where the person was, and usually for victims of the Holocaust, those who didn't survive. But I believe for you, they also did it for Selma.
Yeah, they actually changed the rules at some point. I don't know when. So now anyone who was displaced from their home. So my father also has one. So they survived, but they could have the stone because they were displaced. And it has their name etched into it, what happened to them and what year that happened.
This question has been asked by a few people, some privately to me. How did the furniture get out of Germany? It was a teaser in your
Here's
presentation.
another spoiler if you read the book. It's still worth reading the book because these stories are just amazing. But I could not understand, right, how their furniture would get there. And I was racking my brain, and my son and I were coming up with all kinds of stories. And Josh's story was, well, maybe the family who, Aryanized the home did it. And I'm like, no, there's no way. So one day in our third trip, my husband and I are in the archives in Munster, where we had asked them to pull all of the records of my family's property. And it turns out there were 800 pages of documents. Most of them were letters between my Oma and the Aryanizer, right, or their lawyers. So obviously there was a lot of anger there. And, we're flipping through all this German documents. I don't know German very well. I don't know German. I know a few words. And it's 800 documents. So we're just taking picture. And we get to something that's in English. And it's the English translation of two things. One is a lease agreement, which I won't get into here, and one is the sale agreement, the actual Aryanizing sale agreement. So it was sold, and I know the price it was sold for. But there was an addendum in that agreement that said that the Aryanizer had to make sure that the furniture, and it lists all the things, the porcelain, the silverware, the linens, were sent to the place my family was staying in Hendringen as part of the settlement. So I feel like they had been friendly before things got bad. And then obviously they were not friends anymore. So I think that's a remarkable story. And I don't know if that man, Johann, is aware of that unless he's read the book. And I'm not sure if he's read the book. So.
Yeah, you talk a little bit more about that. I don't want to give anything away. So a few more questions from the audience. And again, it's a great time if you want, raise the hand raise emoji, which will signal that you have a question. I'll be able to call on you, or unmute yourself because I can't see everyone. Thank God we have a nice turnout. Thank you everyone for being here. Or continue putting your questions or comments in the chat and I'll read them for you. So somebody asks, the Jewish shops mainly clothing. So they're asking who made the clothing, and they asked, was your father a tailor?
So it would have been my grandfather. I'm not sure if my grandfather was a tailor or if they did hire people. I know that because there's some documentation about people who worked for my family. I wonder if my Oma sewed. I'm not totally sure, but I kind of imagine she did so. So I think they employed people who did most of the sewing, but I'm not 100% certain.
Another question, which I also had, somebody asks, did any of the people who helped your family, the rescuers, those who saved your family, become righteous among the nations, or were they recognized as righteous among the nations?
Right. Well, Leonard Overdown is definitely recognized at Yad Vashem, and there's been a documentary made about him. But he's one of the bigger names. So the Lansing family has not been recognized. It's something that I started trying to do, but Jan, the man that I knew, he was so emotional about all of it. And we had that language barrier that I just couldn't get the information from him that I needed to finish up the application. And even with his son's help, who speaks fluently English, and very sadly, Jan passed away last year. So I don't have access to that information anymore. And I need to figure out, it's on my list of things to do to try to figure out if I can submit his name. I don't know for sure about the others.
Okay. In your book, you share, before I ask the question, did I see a hand raised? Is that Jeff? Yeah? Can you unmute yourself? And
yes.
I'm sorry, I don't see other people, so just, yeah.
Okay. Thank you. I mean, you've talked so movingly about all the upstanders, and I'm just curious, did your father ever hear of any stories of how close they came to being betrayed in especially in the last farm? I'm just curious about it, because I know it didn't take much, I think, a pound of sugar for people to be given to betray someone in the Netherlands.
Right. He says there were 6 close call stories. You heard one of them. Their family was not going to betray them. And in fact, there's a story that my father shared in his video that I write about in the book, where American soldiers parachute into the farm next door, and the farmer family come out and get them into, somewhere safe or whatever. Then I don't really know where they went. And the Germans arrive, and they tie this family to the trees and do stuff to them that's terrible. And the family never gave up the Allied soldiers, never gave them up, never gave up that they knew people were hiding in farms around there. So these are just remarkable people.
Yeah.
And just one more thing. My father, he used to tell me as a kid, so this is one thing I remember, but I don't know exactly what he said to me, but my memory is they used to shoot at us. So that, the Germans would come in, they would shoot up into the attic, knowing that people hid in attics. And so he'd have to crouch in a corner to avoid being hit by the bullets. So the farmer could have given them up and said, you know what, I have Jews here, take them. But he never did. He never did.
Oh.
Jeff, thanks so much for the question. Irene, thank you for answering that. You wrote in your book that that it's written based on the research that you did thus far at the time. Is there anything new that you discovered or uncovered since publishing the book that you think is important to share with us? Or
there's an amazing story that happened that isn't about the 1940s, but is about my father's visit in 1991. And it's a very convoluted story, but it turns out that I'm going to try to keep it simple. My father visited in 1991. He went to the town hall in Hendringen to pull the police report. And this man, Peter, who worked there, had just uncovered that police report 3 weeks prior. And he overheard my father asking for it. And when he uncovered this police report, he said to his friend, we'll never know what happened to them. And then 3 weeks later, my father shows up. I didn't know that, right? All I knew is that my father got the police reports. Like, he didn't tell me any of this other amazing stuff. So maybe 2 years ago, a friend of mine who lives in Belholt found a Dutch book where there was an interview of my father by a man named Peter Bresser, same guy. And I ended up tracking him down. And he is my age. I thought he'd be long gone, but he's my age. And he couldn't believe that he got to, communicate with the daughter of this man. So it's like a double kind of coincidence. I call it a beshert, meant to be. Somebody guiding us to come together. And I hope to get to meet him. But just the fact that, my father had this experience in 1991, to me is an amazing part of the story.
Yeah, you mentioned you have a lot of these beshert moments in your book, and reading it, you can understand it more. From reading your book, it felt, for me, I'm a 3G, a grandchild of Holocaust survivors, but I think this resonates with anyone. There's a beautiful theme throughout the book. It was an extremely cathartic or therapeutic experience reading it. So I'm wondering, what was writing this book like for you? What has it done for you?
Yeah, so, it's interesting. I know you're supposed to journal when you're upset about something, you need to process something, and that was never my thing. I don't like writing. So I never did that. But as I was writing the book, I realized I saw the value of doing that. It was cathartic. It helped me process things. It helped me in the early drafts of the book. It helped me remember things from my childhood that I weren't on my consciousness until I was writing them. So writing was part of the healing process for me. And I cried a lot while I was writing. I cried a lot. And I'm okay with that.
Amen. Can you talk about the first time you shared your father's testimony, what that experience was like?
The first time I shared it with a group.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
So I was sharing it with friends, like groups of friends. I was kind of beta testing my presentation a number of times. And so I don't actually remember, to be honest with you. The one thing I can tell you is, still to this day, I can't listen to the words my father is saying when I play his snippets. It's just too much. It's too much. So in my notes, I write down the last 3 words that he says, and that's how I know it's time to resume. But it's still very emotional for me.
And your son Josh accompanied you on, I believe, all of the trips to Germany and Holland. And I know your family, including your husband and your other son Jonah, supported your journey as well in many ways. Are your sons, who are also 3Gs, involved in Holocaust education or want to know more about their family's story?
They are not. I had this dream that Josh would be like doing this with me, but he's got a lot of things going on, so he's not able to. But we'll see if that does happen maybe one day. And my son Jonah, my younger son, he was a little marginally interested. When I mentioned Queen Wilhelmina gave them a stay, that was cool. Like, it's the cool things that he engaged with. But it wasn't until he actually read the book, and he did read the book, that he started getting it, I think. And as it turns out, this year is the triennial Kristallnacht commemoration year in November. And Jonah said he would go. So this year I'm taking Jonah, as well as Josh and Josh's partner Addie, to Germany and Holland, and we're going to see all those places again. So I'm really excited to see it through Jonah's eyes. Josh and I experienced this, and then I wrote about it. Jonah read about it, and now he's going to have some kind of experience. So we'll see what happens. And he's not involved in any Jewish thing, I would say. He won't even come to our house for a Seder. But we'll see what this does. I'm really curious to know how this will maybe alter something.
Beautiful. I look forward to following up with you and asking how that goes.
Wish me luck.
Amen. Yeah, I do. You bring up a number of books within your book, ones that you read, and one is about descendants of survivors and their thoughts about reclaiming citizenship in the countries where their parents or grandparents were from. And you yourself explored obtaining German citizenship, and also just you talked about your whole process of your father and Uma would not return to Germany. I believe your father went to Holland, though, to visit. So what was that process like for you? I know a lot of 2Gs, children of survivors, experience this ambivalence or conflict of, am I going to reclaim citizenship of a country that did not want my family there and complicit at the least in murdering our families? I know for 3Gs, for most of us, there's a slightly different experience, but just a little bit about your experience in general, what that was like for, I guess, either both traveling there or just, since you talked a little bit about that, reclaiming citizenship and that idea.
Well, it definitely took me a while to get to that point of wanting it. But after my second trip, which was the transformational trip, and my understanding of German society and government for the most part, I really wanted my German citizenship. And you know, there are problems in every country, but Germany is one of the better places to be. If I had to flee this country, I don't know that I could live in Germany, but Germany would get me entry into the Netherlands, right? Because of the EU. So I'm not going to flee this country. You know, my kids are here and they're staying here, so I'm staying here. But if I had young kids, that would be a consideration. And so I am excited to maybe one day get my German citizenship.
Beautiful. Just looking at some of the questions that we have.
And I just want to say, like, you know, who talks about having to flee their country, except for 2Gs and maybe some other groups, but yeah, it's kind of crazy talk, but not to us. We all get it.
It's a good point. In your book, you share your father's recollection of Kristallnacht, and you mentioned some of that testimony in your presentation, the hatred that could be heard and felt vibrating in the air. Reading your father's words at this moment in a post-October 7th world, for me especially, I would say in New York City, where the protests are happening all over me, it just feels so eerie. You described some of the, or showed some of the pictures, and you mentioned that Simchat Torah is one of your favorite holidays in the book. So what is it like revisiting your father's testimony, doing these presentations, again, in a post-October 7th world with such urgency, with anti-Semitism all around us?
What is it like? So before October 7th, it was bad. I will say it was bad. There was an anti-Semitic incident, violent one, every month somewhere. Now it's far worse. And so before October 7th, I felt like I had to share this story with people whoever would have me, particularly in non-Jewish groups. That's my, you know, that's where I'd really like to share the story. But now I feel that even more so. You know, I have an obligation for many reasons. You know, I'm gifted with this burden of the story and the ability to tell it and the details I have, and I have this obligation. So now of all times, it has to be shared is how I feel about it.
Agreed. We have a few more questions from the audience, and one of them is, you sort of touched upon this with intergenerational trauma. Someone asked, how do you feel your father's and family's experience affected you? And they said that they were learning about Jewish intergenerational trauma. They were curious about that experience.
Yeah. You know, I didn't have that word until I read the book Survivor Cafe, which I have right here. That was a transformational book to me. that I read right before my second trip. And it talked about intergenerational trauma. And, sometimes you need the word to describe the feeling, and then it just becomes so much easier to talk about it. So I have intergenerational trauma, and not having been able to talk about it for the first, 50 some odd years of my life was really, really difficult. And I don't know how many of you have that same kind of experience. Now that I can talk about it, it helps me to heal from it. I mean, I won't be ever totally healed. But my father never, he never talked about it. So he had the trauma, and that I can see he had PTSD. They didn't have that word for it either at the time. So he was never properly treated for it. So there are all these levels of, psychological mismanagement of our family, which is so common. And maybe it would be handled better now. I don't even know. But yeah, and it's a challenge. It's still a challenge because I'm still triggered by certain things, but at least now I understand what that triggering is, and I can have my rational side come out, but I'm still triggered.
Couple more questions from the audience. Somebody asked if your father, and I'll extend it to his family, from what you know, did they ever feel safe living in Germany during the late 20s and the 30s? And they continue, if not, why stay as long as they did? And I think in your book you mentioned that there were some plans already in place, but if you can speak a little bit more about that, please.
Yeah, so I guess you're referring to the years before Hitler came into power. Did they feel safe? I really don't know, but from what I can see based on my research, they acted as though they were safe because they had this business. They, they were out openly Jewish, as was the rest of the community. And I think German Jews felt like during the Weimar years, I think they were, felt fine. That's my impression of society in general. Before Weimar, not so much. Like there was this little lull in there. I read a book called The Pity of It All, which is about the history of the Jews in Germany. And it's never been great for Jews in Germany, except for maybe that little period of time. So why did they stay as long as he did? I used to ask my father this question, like, why didn't you just leave? I didn't understand. I was a little girl. I didn't get it. But why they didn't leave Germany is they couldn't, right? There were quotas here in America. And so you had to have a low number to be able to immigrate. And they didn't have a low number. They had a number. I don't know how high it was, but their turn hadn't come up. So even though they tried, they weren't able to get out.
In fact, that's something you mentioned in your book, right? Your father's aunt had a low number, and they did.
Yes,
And
Aunt Matilda got out in 1939. That's right. And they had come to say goodbye. Aunt Matilda was visiting them on Kristallnacht, actually. Yep.
And that was the eve of your father's 12th birthday.
Yes, which he never celebrated again, apparently.
A couple more questions. How did your father's family, I guess it was your father or somebody with him, know about the border police guard and the amount of time they would be away in order to cross the border?
I feel like he'd make a really good bank robber. He really scoped it out. But remember, he was crossing the border to go take his customers' orders and then fill those orders. So that was one of the border crossings. Oh, and part of the story that I found out afterwards is that border crossing where we know he crossed was known to be a smuggling border crossing. So I don't know. I'll ask about this when I go there this time, but I don't know if the guard was lenient and left early on purpose, or if that's just how it was. And so people knew that there was a gap. But, bread was smuggled across the border. People were smuggled from the local work camp across the border. So yeah, so I guess he scoped it out and it probably was not such a surprise.
That reminds me how you just said it could have been this or possibly that. In your book, for some of the things you still have questions about. I mean, the more we learn, the more questions we have. And I think you handle that beautifully in your book. You talk about it could have been this, maybe it was that, and a lot of that based on your research, what people did, what the situation was like, and also based on the documents that you had available to you from your family. You did an excellent job putting it out there like that in your book.
Thank you.
Another question you might not know, I'm not sure. Someone asked, what was your family's Jewish identity like pre-1933, and how has it changed or changed after immigrating to the United States, and how it was manifested or affected your life?
Right. So I'm not sure what it was, but here are the things I am sure about. My great-grandmother Selma would not eat pork in hiding, and that might have contributed to her illness because on religious grounds. But my father and Oma did. But growing up, we never did. All right. So Selma was somewhat observant, at least I know that. My Oma and my father, no, they weren't so observant, but there were certain things that they would say to me from time to time that led me to realize that they had at one point been more observant. So yeah, I mean, we went to services every Shabbat, my brother and I and my father mostly, not my mother so much. But we weren't Shabbat observers, and we didn't keep strictly kosher at home. So I assume that came from my father and not my mother. Well, I know that came from my father and not my mother.
And maybe we can leave off with one final question. If you have any final thoughts or messages that what you like to leave with your reader, what you would leave with us today.
Yeah, I mean, really how I ended my talk, which is just to be the light in the world, to bring some light to the world by doing whatever actions we can, whether it's getting people to vote or voting ourselves or being kind to somebody, letting somebody cross the street when we're in the car, little things that just make the world a better place. And I want to work on this too, but seeking out people who are different than us and having a cup of coffee with them, because that's where it all really starts. The grassroots connecting with people. That's how we're going to get to being able to live together in this world. So hard, but we got to start somewhere, and we can each start with ourselves. That's my message.
Amen. Maybe before I have the coffee with someone else, I'm going to have it with myself too.
That's a good idea.
Then I'll invite. Beautiful. I want to thank you so much. Again, your book is incredible. I'm just going to show the cover again, and then we'll share a link to for people to read it. It's absolutely amazing. And again, just interconnecting your story with your father's and how it transcends place and time. And your presentation is remarkable as well. I look forward to hearing about the trip again, your next trip to Germany and Holland. And thank you so much for everything, and for everyone for being here. Thank you all for being here. I hope to see you again on Wednesday, September 25th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Everyone be well and take care.
Thank you all. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.